Welcome to Smith Weekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of Smith Weekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at Smith Weekly, including Paul M., Andy S., Mike P., and Ryan S. On the program today is a new guest, Mr. Doomberg, who identifies as the Green Chicken, is with us on the program. Mr. Doomberg is the lead chicken at the Chicken Coop that writes attractive and well-positioned commentary on energy, natural resources, the market, finance, and more to establish the fundamentals that are missing from many of the conversations and decision making. You can learn more about Mr. Doomberg and their work via their website, Doomberg, which is doomberg.substack.com. Mr. Doomberg, welcome to the program.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction.
Absolutely. Yeah, we try to be creative. Appreciate you coming on and chatting with us. Well, why don't we kick it off here as normal with new programs? Tell the audience about your background and experience in the markets, how this all formed for you, and how you see the markets.
You bet. Doomberg, as you mentioned, is a small team of former industry experts that write on Substack. We publish 6 to 8 commentary articles per month. We have an ever-growing list of readers. It's been a real blast. We started Doomberg 2.5 years ago under the assumption that there was something missing in the discourse around energy, and in particular, it was that industrial lens. Most of the commentary that we see either comes from government officials or university professors or folks that really haven't spent much time working in commodity companies in the sector who understand the sort of the realities on the ground. And most people who are in industry are prohibited from commenting because they have public affairs teams in between them and the public, and they have stock options and stock prices to worry about, and they want to be seen as saying and doing all the right things. And of course, the mainstream media does a disservice to the public as well. And so that was the market inefficiency that we identified 2.5 years ago. As you mentioned, we write about energy, finance, and the economy at large, and having a blast doing it. And my personal background is I'm a scientist by training. I spent several decades working in and around energy and commodities, the whole gamut of traditional engineering projects to improve existing work processes to major investments in new energy technologies and everything in between. And like I say, we spent a couple of years consulting and then built Doomberg starting in 2021, and it's blown up beyond all of our wildest dreams.
You guys have been really successful in the model. The Green Chicken application has been excellent. And just the quality of the work is really well done. So I definitely commend you on that. And, you're right. There's a lot of startups in the media side and, independent research, et cetera. There's just so much really kind of post, call it 3 years ago, let's call it post-COVID. There's been a lot of alternative media that's come in and about. That carries so much more quality than just your traditional sources. And then, of course, you're right. I think what you were trying to say to some degree is some of those folks at the higher levels just don't have that real world experience, or they just can't provide that because of their limitations, in their contracts or what have you. So why don't we move to just generally here, and then I want to get into some details, but, tell us about how you look at energy, some of the irrational thinking out there, and where you think energy is heading in the coming decades.
We look at energy from this is a bit of a tired phrase, but a first principles perspective. We look with physics as our guide. And anybody who studies energy long enough quickly comes to the following conclusion, that basically energy is life, which is a phrase that we have tried to popularize. So everybody listening to this podcast, their standard of living is defined by how much energy they get to harness. And since all humans everywhere want an ever-increasing standard of living, it is just this human endeavor, which is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy. You need energy in order to impose order on your local environment. Right angles do not appear spontaneously in nature. The more energy you get to harvest, the wealthier you are. And you either go flying commercial with the general public to, if you get rich enough, flying a private jet. The carbon footprint in our society and across all society scales with wealth. And reducing carbon footprint basically means keeping people poor, and most people don't want to be poor. And so when we look at energy, we look at the following sort of grand trade-off equation, which is how much net energy are we producing as a society divided by our impact on the planet. And we believe that is the equation that we should be optimizing. Far too much of our discourse focuses only on minimizing the denominator with no thought given to the impact on the numerator. And in our view, it's the numerator that is the fundamental driver of, of humanity in its pursuit of energy. And in order to really make an impact on the environment, we have to consider those trade-offs.
Very well. And I want to come into that in more detail now and bring up just a piece you also did recently, let's call it a month ago or so. I might be a little bit off on my dates, but a piece done on ExxonMobil and the pressure from groups such as BlackRock and Vanguard over fossil fuels. This opens up a lot of discussion and probably more discussion than we have time for today. But talk about this particular article in the context of what you saw coming out of that research and work on that article, and then your take on these pressures on fossil fuel initiatives out there to basically remove fossil fuels from our lives. But unfortunately, they're part of our daily lives and will be that way for, I can't even estimate how long, for a long time going forward, maybe forever. Just talk about that and how you see these pressures.
Yeah, the piece you mentioned is one we put out in mid-October called Power Play. And it starts with the state of affairs in mid-2021 for Exxon and its CEO, Darren Woods. And as we said in the piece, it was things were not looking so great for Mr. Woods, who is, of course, an Exxon lifer. And anybody who's interacted with Exxon knows that this is a very inward-looking culture, and it's very, very difficult to climb the ladder as an outsider there. And he was facing an unexpected assault from above. And you mentioned BlackRock, who, Larry Fink, as the CEO of BlackRock, is featured as sort of the opposite, the yin and the yang of Darren Woods. And at that time, of course, BlackRock and Vanguard and all of these money aggregators, as we call them, were because of passive investing, accumulating an enormous number of shares in basically every publicly traded company in the world. And they started to come under pressure from environmentalists to exercise the financial leverage that would typically come with being an owner of a company, i.e., voting your shares and pressuring management to make change. And Fink, in particular, you may recall, he was writing in his annual letter to CEOs all about climate. And in fact, the 2021 edition of his annual letter mentions the word climate an incredible 27 times. And he was the catalyst behind a stunning defeat by Exxon at its annual shareholder meeting, and this unheard of outfit called Engine Number One, ultimately with the backing of Fink and others, were able to secure 3 board seats at Exxon. A real stunning rebuke of Mr. Woods and his leadership, frankly, and this was celebrated widely, of course, in the mainstream media as a milestone for the ESG movement. And the point of the piece is, in fact, that may have marked peak ESG in hindsight, and what a difference 2 short years can make. But if the world is moving away from fossil fuels, nobody's told ExxonMobil, and based on what we think are some pretty intelligent strategic moves they've made this year, including the acquisition of Denbury and the acquisition, or at least the attempt to acquire Pioneer, a pretty remarkable turn of events. And as we show in the piece, Exxon stock has returned basically a little over 100% since that fateful day in May of 2021, while BlackRock shares have slumped 25% over the same time period. And we would argue that 130% difference in total return is the ultimate scorecard for CEOs. And by that measure, Exxon and Mr. Woods have done quite well.
Well said. And I think this opens up a few other things that we need to discuss and get your take on. But I guess before we do that, talk about fossil fuels from viewpoint in terms of everybody thinks of fossil fuels generally as, potential energy sources, fuel for their cars, these types of things. But talk about fossil fuels on the day-to-day basis. And maybe there's some folks out there that just don't understand that fossil fuel is with us daily, even if we're not driving cars.
85% roughly of the world's global energy needs are currently served by fossil fuels. And the growth of so-called renewable energies has not shrunk by 1 gram. the amount of fossil fuels we are consuming worldwide. And that might sound weird to people, but we put out a piece a couple of months ago where we developed what we call Doomberg's postulate, which states every molecule of fossil fuels produced in the world will be burned by somebody somewhere. And local restrictions in that regard merely shift who gets to enjoy the privilege. What we're seeing in 2023, record production and demand for coal, record production and demand for oil, record production and demand for LNG, all while wind and solar are, coming off the bottom a little bit and beginning to be somewhat meaningful in our energy mix. Why is that? Because 5 or 6 billion people on this planet live a lifestyle that nobody listening to this podcast would recognize. They are all desperately hungry for energy and the life nourishing consequences that having an abundance of energy provides. And if we stop using coal, or oil, or natural gas, the global south, as it's known, will happily and greedily consume it. And everywhere we look, we're seeing the same thing. And this thought that the richest countries in the world proactively and voluntarily deciding to shift some portion of their energy needs into a renewable solution is going to meaningfully change how much fossil fuels get burned around the world. It's just naive and it's a complete failure of understanding of how the energy markets actually work.
The reality is so much different than the narrative being promoted out there. Just the fact that these materials come in the form of resins and plastics and compounds and various things that we're using. Our devices we're using daily come from this product. Aside from the energy need, all of these various products are derived from fossil fuel materials, which a lot of people tend to forget. Um, let's stick on BlackRock for a moment. As you know, one of the largest concentrations of wealth, if not the largest concentration of wealth in human history, from my understanding. With that concentration of wealth comes incredible positions of power to drive decisions for government and therefore impact the lives of all people. Thoughts on that concentration and thoughts on that newfound, let's go use this concentration as leverage to implement our thinking?
It's a fascinating question. So if you just take BlackRock, they essentially create ETFs that are meant to expose their investors to a diversified basket of risk depending on their investor desires. For the longest time, it was assumed that because these flows were passive, that BlackRock and Vanguard and these types of firms shouldn't really be allowed to vote the proxy the way Larry Fink thinks the proxy should be voted, right? Larry Fink is making a decision for all of the passive investors that flow into his ETF. And there are probably at least as many investors in the S&P 500 ETF that are pro fossil fuels as there are investors who are opposed to it. And the move by Fink and others to usurp the power of the individual investors in their ETF is a novel development and a bit of a controversial one. And so and in fact, Fink has, as we mentioned in the piece, of course, as we jokingly called it, he entered the find out phase of political activism and began to see large pension funds at the state level, especially those that you would consider sort of the Republican South, begin to move their money out of BlackRock's management and into other funds. And Fink has since led a hasty retreat on the matter and is now regularly bemoaning how polarizing the ESG debate has come and probably regrets his participation in it. It's a bit of revisionism, of course, because in his telling of how things happened, he was he played no role in creating the controversy that he now finds himself in. But this concentration of power in the hands of few, as you call it, is really just a symptom of the wealth gap that keeps growing in our country as well. And this, of course, will only be further exacerbated by the forced implementation of ESG policies, because the wealthy can insulate themselves from these policies, and these are the ultimate, tax on the poor.
Appreciate your comments on that, and it certainly is a very interesting set of affairs that we have here. And if we could get into discussions about concentration of wealth and the bankers of the world and playing all sides narrative, pretty clear that that is coming more and more to become obvious for people sorting out who really pulls the strings. But let's talk a little bit here. You mentioned BlackRock and their push on ESG and the potential for peak ESG, which sounds pretty good, but also big narratives like climate change. I'd like to get the chicken coop's view on climate change.
As I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, we have this sort of overall trade-off equation that we like to focus on, which is the net energy that we produce as a society divided by our impact on the environment. And we would divide our impact on the environment into two categories, and they're often convoluted or combined with each other in a way that is a bit deceptive. One category is pollution, and the other category is carbon emissions. And so, if we focus on pollution for a bit, I think there are serious challenges with the commodity sector and the fossil fuel industry and the chemical industry that need to be addressed. I think it's fair to expect that companies operating around the world should be held to a high standard with regard to pollution. One of the big challenges that we see worldwide, of course, is that China holds its domestic producers to a different standard than ours, and that allows them to crowd out Western producers of critical goods. And this is how China has grown to monopolize so many of the critical minerals that we need to operate a society. We put a piece out at the end of October called Geopolitical Warfare, with the social preview, how China destroys its environment to create monopolies and what we can do about it. But as it pertains to carbon emissions, this obviously is a hyper-polarized debate. It has sort of jumped the shark. There's no convincing anybody on either side. You either think, global warming and CO2 is a giant fraud perpetrated by the left, or you think global warming and CO2 is putting the entire planet at risk, and we are condemning future generations to outright poverty, and dastardly lives by our greedy consumption of fossil fuels today. We would fade climate alarmism. We are bullish the human capacity to invent solutions to circumvent any negative consequences of our continued carbon emissions. We think that the technology pulse is radically underestimated by the population explosion crowd, the limits to growth crowd, the Malthusian environmentalists who think that we should have far fewer people on the planet. And so that's kind of our position. I mean, there's some optionality we could build into our economy to allow us to remove carbon from fossil fuels. There's some very innovative approaches being tested and developed in the market, and those should be pursued. But by and large, we would fade climate alarmism. We think that we're pretty smart. Unleashed, the human spirit can overcome many challenges, including whatever negative consequences may come from the slow rise of carbon emissions that are projected to occur over the next century.
I appreciate that. It's good to bring out some of those points. And I think you and I both agree on things like responsible extraction of natural resources, high standards for companies that are in these industries about curbing things that are pollutive, and sensible steps I think that we can take, and fully optimistic on human ingenuity, optimistic and bullish humans for sure. At the same time, sadly, with climate, sadly more about control than climate, just after some spending some time on these issues, that it's more about controlling the population rather than actually helping the environment. Of course, we've seen this for decades and decades and decades, that the end of the world is just 10 years away or 5 years away, what have you. And this has been happening for a long period of time. So do some work, spend some time, listen to credible people that actually do the work, take the time to do that. Quite a conundrum, but I think overall there's a set of sensible solutions that I think most people could actually come and agree on for the most part. With the comments just briefly on ESG, maybe just talk about ESG just briefly and where you see ESG going, and if we should base our investments solely based on ESG scores.
Well, ESG, of course, stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it has been co-opted by the progressive environmental left to focus exclusively on three things, really: wind, solar, and electric vehicles. I mean, that's what ESG means in the context of the modern discussion. Who could be opposed to stronger environmental stewardship, good governance, and a focus on more than just the bottom line, but perhaps some societal impacts as well? And if we look at wind, solar, and electric vehicles, with the modern definition of ESG, I think the wind industry is on the verge of collapse. We've written about this several times, most recently in a piece called Windbaggery. Solar, I think, it has a role to play in places that get a lot of sun, but it's forced installation in places like Germany, which has the solar incidence of Maine, is just silly. Its capacity factor integrated over the year of 10 or 11% is a giant waste of money. It makes no sense. And of course, the problem with solar is it's completely and totally controlled by China for reasons that we outlined in geopolitical warfare. Virtually every solar panel on Earth finds its way through China and uses cheap thermal coal and slave labor to crowd out Western manufacturers. I was in the industry when China took it over, we think illegally. And then as far as electric vehicles go, I think the market is beginning to fade that as well. I think there's a fine role to be played for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and using reasonably sized batteries to get more and more efficiency out of the gasoline we do consume. But by and large, I think the full battery electric vehicle mania has faded as well. And of course, China's positioned itself to dominate that market as well in a piece we wrote called Build Your Dreams. We talked about how Warren Buffett backed BYD is going to take the world by storm. And in the intervening months since we published that piece, we see further and further evidence. It might surprise some of your listeners to learn that BYD now builds more full battery electric vehicles than even Tesla and has a full complement of plug-in hybrids to spare. It actually sells batteries to Tesla. It's just amazing to see how BYD is just taking the world by storm. And this is a playbook that China has played over and over and over again. And so I think when we mentioned peak ESG, as geopolitical tensions rise between the US and China, ESG, of course, will fall to the wayside because China dominates those industries and we can't rely on them just for national security. And so that's sort of where we are on the ESG state of affairs.
That's great. Opened up another set of things that we could certainly discuss here, but again, I'll try to pick out a few of them. But just the control of the supply chain by China, whether you're talking about copper, whether you're talking about cobalt, lithium, graphite, rare earths, there's a few others as well, but it's substantial supply chain control. And I want to come to wind and solar in just a moment and talk a little bit more detail about that. But this control of the supply chain by China is substantial. There has to be efforts deployed to reduce that reliance upon what's been structured there. And then as well, your comments on EVs. And we see relatively intelligent companies like Toyota and their leadership, take a different pathway on these issues. EVs, to some degree, in some urban applications, but in the countryside, they don't work. Certainly do not. And there has been studies, and again, this is an area that we haven't spent a lot of time on, Mr. Doomberg, but just the consumption and the waste chain of EVs, and also the requirements, the inputs to building EVs. Of course, you're outsourcing the energy portion of that, the charging of these vehicles out to coal and gas and what have you, maybe a little bit of wind and solar, but it's insignificant. But what are your thoughts just on internal combustion engine versus the consumption of EVs at this point? There have been studies pointing to internal combustion engine may not require as much. What are your thoughts just on EVs in general and maybe the approach that Toyota's taken with battery technology, et cetera?
Sure, we wrote a piece. I guess I have photographic memory for all the titles of our pieces because I live and eat and sleep and dream Doomberg, as you can imagine. We wrote a piece recently called Kaizen Battery, where we kind of had a skeptical look at Toyota's claims around solid state battery breakthrough. But by and large, Toyota is routinely held up as the ultimate example of the innovator's dilemma, which is the opening story for that piece, where big companies are necessarily good at serving their existing companies, which is what makes them big. But this cultural wiring is what makes them resistant to change in the first place. And so Toyota has, in our view, correctly resisted the BEV mania, but it has not done so without some penalty. Of course, its stock price has languished, and it has not. It is routinely criticized by outside investors and so on for being too slow and not innovative enough. But in reality, as we argued in the piece, the Toyota Prius is probably responsible for abating more carbon emissions than any other consumer product in history. Here's the fundamental issue with electric vehicles. We are constrained by battery materials. There's not enough cobalt, lithium, nickel, copper to fully electrify everybody's car. And when I was in management, we always had a dogma, which was that if we have a constraint, we must manage to that constraint. So if you take a typical battery electric vehicle, let's say it has an 80 kilowatt hour battery in it. If we put all 80 kilowatt hours of that battery into one car, we are abating the gasoline use, not the energy use, of course, but the gasoline use of 100% of one driver's car. if you divide that battery into four 20 kilowatt hour batteries and sell four plug-in hybrids, which still have an internal combustion engine as backup, but can run predominantly on the battery. Let's just say that 20 kilowatt hours gets you 40 miles of range before you have to kick in the internal combustion engine as backup. That can abate up to 90% of four drivers gasoline demand. And then let's just say it's 70% or even 50%. If we can abate 50% of the gasoline use of four drivers, I can do simple math. 0.5 times 4 is 2, which is twice as good as 1. And so batteries are the constraint. The technology for plug-in hybrids exists, but for some reason, the environmentalists are substantially opposed to plug-in hybrids. They get infuriated whenever governments express support for them. And of course, this limited use of batteries, if you used 4 kilowatt hours to make a nice hybrid that gets 45 or 50 miles per gallon, and you could spread that over 20 vehicles, so you could do the math. The opportunity to abate gasoline uh, is real. It won't, of course, reduce our demand for oil, which is something we can talk about. But our view on battery electric vehicles is we'd be more than happy and perfectly fine to drive a plug-in hybrid. That those drivetrains offer the maximum amount of environmental benefits with the minimum amount of consumer drawbacks. And I think once we work our way through the later phases of this EV mania, we will pivot back to reality, and the large automakers will be allowed to keep making internal combustion engines because there is no real substitute. And we'll probably all be driving highly fuel efficient cars into the 2030s and 40s.
Very good points here. Very good. I appreciate that, and I think it puts it into good context. And I'm still a proud Toyota diesel driver myself, but hey, just for the sake of time, I want to move from EVs off here and come back to just your views of large scale commercial, industrial, if you will, wind and solar energy. I think that in certain applications, solar has obviously promises and use in smaller, probably more residential, remote applications potentially, but small scale. And I think there's a limitation there. Wind is very, very much more questionable. But what are your thoughts on these two sources, just from the view of we know that they don't work that well? I suppose the waste and the footprint component that so many people have forgotten about, and then also just that these solar farms, for example, and of course wind has similar issues, but the solar farms and just the overall, wasting away of the panels from, of course, the sun, and then of course that leaching onto the ground and contaminating potentially substantial tracts of land, and then of course wind and wildlife and all these other things. But just the fact that they wear out so quickly, and the waste supply chains with battery technology, maybe come at it from the angle of waste and footprint, and just give us a few thoughts.
You bet. I would partition the discussion between wind and solar because they're very different. And they both have their drawbacks, but we think wind is fatally wounded and frankly won't be around for much longer. I think that industry is in massive crisis, something we've been calling for all year. If we take solar, there are parts of the world where solar makes a fair bit of sense. So, for example, in the U.S. Sun Belt, there's a sort of seasonal, where it's hot, the demand for electricity scales with the potential for solar to provide it. Whereas in Germany, again, not to pick on our favorite country, but the demand for electricity and energy scales in the winter when there's less sun, and it makes absolutely no sense to put solar there. So I would start with the geographic consideration. Solar is a reasonable alternative in some parts of the world for some periods of time. The big challenge with solar is China dominates it. So what does the supply chain for solar look like? Well, it starts with sand. Then you put in an enormous amount of energy and you make solar grade polysilicon, which is then formed into ignits, sliced into wafers, and mounted as cells onto modules, which then get shipped around the world. China has a 97+% control over ignite and forming and wafering and cell production. So even the three remaining polysilicon plants that we have in the U.S., all of that material has to get shipped to China for processing. It's the same thing with rare earth elements for the magnets that are in the wind turbine. Wherever rare earths are mined, 100% of the processing of those rare earths are done in China. And China does this on purpose, like as we said in the piece, geopolitical warfare. You know, in theory, cost differences among producers should be driven by technology innovation, but the reality on the ground is different. In reality, cost differences between consumers in mature industries are often driven by the answer to one simple question, which is how much is each party allowed to pollute? And taken to the extreme, allowing domestic producers to recklessly pollute amounts to a hidden but decisive subsidy on those producers. And China does this over and over and over again, as we recently found out with their graphite export limitations. Now, wind, of course, has its own separate challenges. It is deeply intermittent as well, has a low capacity factor, but also this offshore and the killing of the whales all along the Atlantic coast is a real scandal, and the government's cover-up of it by the NOAA is itself, I think, a deeply embarrassing scandal. We suspect that we will install precious few, if any, major offshore wind installations, as the true destructive nature of these giant pieces of machinery being drilled into the ocean floor comes to bear. So we would be far more bearish on the wind sector than the solar industry. But neither is really a panacea. Look, there is no path, and I'm sure we'll get on to the discussion. There is no path to meaningful decarbonization that does not drive straight through nuclear energy. And there's no need for wind and solar. We have the answer. If fission were invented today, it would be hailed as a civilization-saving invention that we should implement post-haste. And so we'll toy around with solar and wind for a few more years. But when we do eventually get serious about optimizing that trade-off equation of producing more net energy while minimizing the impact on the planet, all roads lead to nuclear.
Very good stuff. A recent guest on our program termed basically wind and solar. And again, I agree. Wind is terrible. Solar has, again, limited use. But this gentleman termed wind and solar as not renewables, but ruinables, which I thought was a nice little play on the words. But anyway, let's move right to what you led into. Let's go from one end of the essentially poor forms of commercial industrial scale energy to high quality, high density forms, such as splitting atoms, fission. What is your position on this energy source, and how much should we strongly look at this?
Well, we think it's the answer. We recently did a full presentation for our pro tier on what we would do if we were in charge. We titled it King Doomberg, a comprehensive energy policy. And in that presentation, the majority of our recommendations for how we would orient society center around a proliferation of safe civilian nuclear energy, or as our friend Josh Wolf likes to call it, elemental energy, because obviously the nuclear industry suffers from one critical problem, which is a branding one. But if we focus on that energy and minimize impact on the planet, nuclear scores across all dimensions. And the biggest con, of course, of the environmentalists is their opposition to nuclear, driven by the fear they've been able to artificially generate around the nuclear waste issue, which is one of the largest canards in the history of propaganda. And so once you could get past the nuclear waste fallacy, no other technology comes close. It's got the highest energy density. It has the shortest energy return on energy invested. Once installed, it can operate for decades. It provides safe, clean baseload power. It really is the solution, which, of course, getting to your point earlier about perhaps this ESG stuff being more about control, there is no reasonable basis for environmentalist opposition to nuclear power, and we are beginning to see around the world that nuclear is enjoying a renaissance. And by the way, nuclear can do just about everything. It can provide electricity. It can provide heat to create steam at industrial sites. We have these cogeneration plants that burn predominantly natural gas to make both electricity and steam. Most people listening might not know that the industrial production of steam accounts for more global carbon emissions than the sum of our transportation and aviation sectors. 10% of our global carbon emissions comes from the need to produce steam to execute manufacturing processes. The latest embodiments of nuclear power plant designs can produce a reasonably good high quality steam for use across many of those applications. So nuclear is the way to go. It will be where we end up if we care about human flourishing, inevitably. It's just the real question is how much pain do we have to suffer between now and then?
Very well said. Well, we love it, as you probably know. We love this solution. We think it makes a lot of sense. It's proven. The safety record's incredible. The waste footprint is very tiny. The land footprint, very tiny. The density, super high. All of what we need. And so, absolutely love it. It's here. It's with us. It's been proven for a long period of time. It has an amazing track record, contrary to maybe a couple Hollywood movies and some of these entrenched environmental groups get paid and survive off of. But I suppose with that comes the progression to an even better source, which is fusion. Obviously, this is not commercially viable yet or commercially deployed, but for many lives, it has always been technically 10 years away. Kind of the slogan, if you will, for fusion, just 10 years away. What are your thoughts on fusion, and do you see this reaching commercial level deployment anytime soon?
Our thoughts on fusion might come as a surprise to you. We think it is a wholly unnecessary distraction. We think fission is perfectly fine for exactly what we need. Um, Fusion, again, environmentalists like to point to the potential of fusion in order to delay the implementation of fission. You can rest assured that the moment fusion does, or if it does, frankly, ever reach commercial viability, they will be like Lucy with the football, and they will suddenly become violently opposed to the implementation of fusion technology, just like they are the implementation of fission. Um, I think investing in fusion is unnecessary. It solves no real problems. Proclaiming that we should focus on fusion is an admission that the fake lies of the environmentalists are now the base case for future energy analysis. In other words, one of the main drivers for fusion is it doesn't create, nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is a non-issue. We shouldn't allow that fundamental axiomatic assumption to be tolerated or normalized in our energy discourse. We should fight back. That we should say, no, that's BS. That's nonsense. And so, as a technological curiosity, as a set of science experiments that might teach us something that we don't yet know in unexpected or surprising ways, sure, keep researching it. But to postpone the implementation of fission, betting on fusion solving quote unquote our problems is in our view foolhardy.
Yeah, it's a legitimate position on that, and it's absolutely silly to think that you can postpone fission in hopes that fusion, once again, only just a couple years away now. So, good stuff there. With that, just coming back to fission, obviously this is an area that you've worked on. So have we. Fission, it's pretty straightforward that the existing reactor fleet around the world consumes one thing, uranium, which is very plentiful on Earth, but very lacking, I suppose, of talent and expertise to pull it out of and get it to market. And of course, there's broken supply chain that still exists today, which I would have never imagined in 2023 that it still is broken. But just your thoughts on the fuel for these reactors, the uranium market. You've been around it for a while. Thoughts on it at this stage?
One thumbnail, one thimble size of uranium has the energy equivalent of a ton of coal, if you can believe that. It's just an amazing resource. And we have so much uranium that many uranium mines around the world can't operate profitably, even at $70 to $75 a pound uranium. And all we need is a higher price of uranium, and we'll have all the supply that we could ever use. It's just that simple. To think that we will somehow inhibit or be inhibited by a lack of uranium as we embark upon a nuclear renaissance, I think is silly. The price of uranium could 10x from here, and the cost of nuclear power wouldn't notice a difference. I mean, it's such a small input into the cost of operating a nuclear power plant, and it requires so little of it to produce so much electricity that it is a very small line item in an otherwise relatively affordable source of energy. And so, again, there's a lot of distortion and propaganda around nuclear, driven by environmentalist Malthusians who oppose it for reasons that have nothing to do with the environment. But we would be bullish uranium. We would be bullish in the long term, of course, not making any investment recommendations. But we would be bullish nuclear because, again, in the end, once you study it, if you do care about carbon emissions, then there's no other path. It has to go through nuclear. Well, I suppose there is another path, which is billions of people starve and die. But nobody's going to be running on that platform anytime soon.
I can think of maybe just one or two people there, Mr. Doomberg, that would probably want that in their dreams, although they may not be saying it directly yet, but it's certainly implied. But
Indeed.
let's save that one for another time. Just overall here, as we wrap up, any other sectors or larger themes that you are watching? Obviously we covered some of them here, but any insights on maybe some other areas that you're looking at that you think maybe the audience should pay attention to at this point?
Yeah, one of the things that we're researching now is this whole framing around ESG and the levelized cost of electricity. We hear this mantra all the time that wind and solar are the cheapest, when in reality, anywhere where they are implemented, electricity becomes more expensive and the grid becomes less reliable. And in fact, this is all based on one giant lie. And the real theme of this piece and much of the work we're doing is that responsible members of industry need to get better at the propaganda game. Solving our quote unquote um, environmental challenges around the world requires no inventions. It requires that the people who know how to do it get better at speaking about it, especially the nuclear power industry. So there's also going to be several pieces with that theme in mind about helping the scientists and engineers who do the dirty work and the heavy lifting that make our economy run are often the ones that are derided the most by these environmentalists. And we think that's a shame, and we think that it's irresponsible, and we think that it's simply unfair. And so those are the propaganda tricks that we try to highlight, and then to arm our readers with a physics-based alternative narrative. And through that framework, story after story just magically appears, of course, because there's an endless amount of it that we can debunk.
Please do that work. Please do assist, because the industry definitely needs that. And I appreciate you taking some of those initiatives, because that, along with things like wisdom transfer, skill transfer in some of these technical industries, which again, they're technical, which means a lot of people don't have the patience or the time to pursue them. But it's an area in which we have significant shortfalls of staff, engineers, training, even university level programs. We're focused on things that are not meaningful, and we've had a significant shortage of good talent, good expertise, good experience, and just the basic, even elementary level education to promote these types of industries and these types of jobs, which are absolutely critical to everything that we have. And so I really appreciate you looking at ways to incentivize and motivate and give new ideas to the industry to help get that message out there in a way that really makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
I think with that, just any other comments for the audience before we go, and then I'll couple that with while you're thinking there. Just wanted to ask you: are the eggs coming from the chicken coop? Are those green as well?
Yeah, no, I think we covered it quite well. Not much to add. We covered a wide range of topics, and I really appreciated coming on. Yeah, the eggs from the chicken coop are in fact green. I mean, why not? And maybe I'll just give a closing commercial for where your listeners could find us, if that's all right.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And let me just say, again, thanks for the time, and we'll stop here for now. But before we do go, please talk about your business and what you can do for the audience who might be considering signing up for your services.
Yeah, you bet. So you can find all of our work at doomberg.substack.com. We are exclusively on the Substack platform. For listeners who are unaware of what Substack is, you could think of it as the YouTube for writers and bloggers, except instead of running an advertising model, it's based solely on subscriptions and the support of your readers. We are 100% subscriber supported. We don't do any advertising or any branding, co-branding, or take any sponsorship to that effect. And nothing wrong with those business models, but for us, and given the types of topics we like to discuss, we would rather have complete editorial freedom to speak our minds as fully as possible. We have almost 200,000 email subscribers and growing. We're the number one paid finance Substack in the world, which is amazing and humbling and thrilling to say. Still in a bit of disbelief, but that's where you'll find our work. You can sign up for monthly or annual subscriptions, and we have a pro tier for those who want to support our work at an even higher level, and they get some extra goodies for joining that tier. But like I say, I really appreciated the time today. It was a fantastic discussion, and looking forward to maybe coming back in the future if you'll have us back on.
Plan on doing that. And just one other thing specifically, what is the best way for folks to reach out, contact you directly with any questions?
Yeah, sure. They could reach us via email, doomberg@protonmail.com, or they could sign up for the free setting at doomberg.substack.com, which then gets them access to previews to all of our pieces. And we're pretty responsive to emails. We're a very small team. We handle everything ourselves. We've not outsourced anything. So we do all of the emails, all of the comments, all of the promotion, all the podcast appearances. It's all either me or our editor in chief, my primary partner in this amazing business. All polite emails will be responded to. Let's put it that way.
Excellent. We like that style. It's too uncommon in this world today, so really appreciate that. And we do recommend on our side that our listeners and readers also do go over and look at that, look hard at the subscription. We think it's a very valuable setup for what you're paying. And once again, really appreciate the conversation and time, and we'll speak again soon.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.